This is the injury report presented by NYU Langone Health. Giants edge rusher Kayvon Thibodeaux is listed as week to week after getting surgery on Wednesday on a fractured scaphoid bone in his wrist. So let's talk with Dr. Guillem Gonzalez-Lomas of NYU Langone Sports Medicine Center to see when K5 could be coming off the edge again. Doc, thanks for joining us. I've broke this bone before. I still have a pin in my right wrist. It happened at college at UMass, and I set the school record in catches that game. Well, what used to be until Victor Cruz came and he wiped that out. So for the viewer who's watching right now who may not know what this bone is, what is the scaphoid bone and how easy is it to fracture? And is this a common injury amongst football players?
Well, good to be here, Brandon. And as always, you're in rare company. The scaphoid is one of the 8 small bones in the wrist. Very unique bone. It's about 80% cartilage, so it doesn't have a lot of area for blood vessels and ligaments. And it's sort of one of those like keystone bones. It can be injured. There's a stat, a couple of studies have looked at this. 1 out of 100 college football players will fracture their scaphoid at some point. So it typically fractures from a fall on an outstretched hand, which of course happens often during football. And, it really is a critical bone. Fractures can be missed very easily. So it's a good thing in Kayvon's case that they caught it.
All right, so they caught it. Back when I did mine in 2005, I wanted to continue to play, but they told me I had to get surgery. So what made doctors decide that surgery is the best option when something like this happens? Is that something that it's like, this is going to help you recover quicker?
Yeah, so absolutely. So first thing to note is it's not always clear that there's a scaphoid fracture. So this is a kind of injury that sometimes it's obvious, but sometimes you fall on the wrist, it's a little achy. You might not even show up to your team doc or trainer and even complain about it. But if left untreated, these can turn out to be what are called non-union, so they don't heal. Now, you can treat these non-operatively, but that usually involves a fairly long period of immobilization. That would mean a cast or a splint, maybe for 10 to 12 weeks in some cases. So a lot of times when they're diagnosed, and in this case, you would have probably gotten not just x-rays, but something like an MRI or a CT scan, or even both. And if it's diagnosed, typically in athletes, you want these guys to get back to playing as soon as possible. And the evidence really shows that if you surgically manage these with some sort of fixation, that you can get them back on the field sooner.
Yeah, I think it was the first time I went for an MRI or CT scan, whichever the one where you're sitting in there and you feel all claustrophobic and it's like, all these crazy noises and you just got to sit there and kind of just relax. Whatever that was my first time doing that. But, Doc, I went for their surgery on Tuesday and I ended up playing that Saturday. We only had, 3 games left in the season that year, so what made them, what makes him go for the surgery in terms of, all right, let's get him back on the field? What's that timeline going to be like for him in terms of the recovery, the rehab, and when he could get back out there on the field?
Great question. And as always, it depends where the fracture is, if the pieces had moved or if they hadn't. So there's a lot of factors that play into the decision of return to play. It's interesting when you ask team physicians after a scaphoid fracture surgery, when they'll let the players return to play, you actually get a lot of differing opinions. So there isn't one set rule. There is not one set number of weeks that it'll take. But generally, you're looking, I would say if you want to decrease the risk of a re-injury, you're looking probably at least 6 weeks. And depending on how the healing occurs, maybe up to 12. A lot of times we'll get additional imaging at the 6-week mark, something like a CT scan, to make sure that there is biological healing occurring, and then you know that it's safe to return that player to play. So it really does depend on a lot of those factors, but I would say in general today at this level, you're probably going to be in the weeks range.
Is it easier for a wide receiver to come back from after this surgery than a pass rusher, since he is he's flexing his arm and wrist a lot more than the wide receiver would?
Yeah, exactly. And you know, the position is a big issue, right? And a wide receiver isn't going to be tackling a lot. They're trying to avoid that. So you might have a receiver type position coming back a little bit sooner for exactly the reasons you gave, because they're not going to be testing it as much. So that factors into it. But again, you really want to get a sense that things are healing biologically, that you're not just relying on the screw to do the work of holding the bones together. Once you see that, you know, and again, usually that's imaging that's going to give you that information, then you feel more comfortable letting that player go back.
Doc, he's got 2 sacks on the season. This is a big year for him. You know, at double-digit sacks last year, all eyes were going to be what he was going to do this year, especially since they brought in Brian Burns on the other side as another pass rusher. Let's say the player wants to get back faster, wants to get back on the field, return to play quicker. What do doctors say to him about kind of protecting the player from himself when it comes to easily re-injuring this scaphoid?
Yeah, look, I think like anything, right? It's always about informing the player, and then everybody comes to a decision that makes sense together. And you and I have talked about this before. You know, we want him to have a long, not just, you know, get back as soon as possible, but have the rest of the season without incident, and then have a good career, you know, have a good rest of his career, and ultimately a good rest of his life. So we want to really avoid re-injury. And so what you want to do is paint a picture to the player of, you know, where we're at in terms of healing. A lot of this is symptom driven too. Like if he's not feeling really any pain, he doesn't have any tenderness, that's a good sign that things are clinically healing. And you put that all together and ultimately make a decision. And look, like you said, you know, in your case, you know, sometimes the decisions are made. We have to factor in where we are in the season. But in this case, this would be a situation where I assume the doctors and the player have had a conversation about benchmarks and where we expect to be at X number of weeks. And if we're there and we're happy with where we're at, then we can head, you know, back and put you back on the field. But there are other things that they can do during the initial rehab period where he's not going to be that active with his hands to keep him in shape, and just make sure he's ready to hit the ground running when he returns.
Well, thanks for educating us on that one, Doc. Hopefully for Kayvon, he can get back out there on the field and keep wreaking havoc, but let's keep him safe first. Thanks for joining us, Doc.
Thank you. Thanks, Brandon.